Hello and welcome again to another edition of Tribulation Ready Survival. I'm Michael, and today we don't have a project for you. I'm going to do something that's rather difficult for me and kind of out of my comfort zone. I'm going to bring you a message the best I can. So I don't do very many of these, so bear with me if you can. Now, this is the fourth or fifth time I've actually shot this entire video. And the reason that it's taken me so many tries is because I keep finding something else, or I think that something isn't quite right. And so, here we go. Today, we're going to talk about Hanukkah and the Maccabees. Mostly the Maccabees. So let's get started. First of all, it is December. It is the early part of December, and people are starting to celebrate their pagan holidays of this month. And also something else that's being celebrated during this month. For the reason I don't understand why Hanukkah is celebrated this month. However, it is. And over the years, I'm sure it's been thousands of years, but over the years, those pagan holidays, we'll call it Christmas, in my house we call it Mithra, but Christmas and Hanukkah have slowly started to get merged together by the main body of human beings. It's celebrated. You'll see it in Christmas parades, you'll see it in light displays, you'll see it in storefronts, you will see it anywhere there's a Christmas display, there's usually a Hanukkah thing. And they are not the same. They're not the same. They have nothing to do with each other. One is a totally pagan holiday you need to do your research on, and the other one is a miracle that occurred. That's why it's called the Festival of Lights, or the Miracle of Lights, that happened in Israel. Now, we're going to talk about Hanukkah for just a second. And Hanukkah is something that was actually celebrated and actually occurred before the birth of Christ, and was celebrated all the way through his life and crucifixion, and still continues to be celebrated today. Now, as I understand it, there's one version of the story where the Greeks or the Romans, sometimes it's used intermixed, which one it was, but to tell the story, version one is that the Maccabees, who we're going to talk about here in just a minute, were surrounded in a fight, in a big fight, and they were cut off. They couldn't get food, they couldn't get water, they couldn't get oil for the menorah, which they kept lit all the time. And on this particular occasion, they were surrounded. They had 1 day's worth of oil, and that lamp burned, the menorah burned for 8 nights. Another version of the story, which is in the Talmud, or the Jewish oral law, says that the temple was destroyed, which it was, and in the clearing, after the clearing of the temple, the menorah was lit in that area, and they only had 1 day of oil. They lit the menorah, it burned for 8 days. So, I've read it both ways. I personally don't celebrate Hanukkah. We do acknowledge that it's a miracle that happened, but we don't celebrate it because it's not a biblical feast as put out in the Bible itself. But we do acknowledge that it exists, and it was a miracle that occurred. Now, that's Hanukkah. This over here is Christmas. Don't think they're the same. They're not to be intermixed, intertwined, celebrated the same because they are not even close. So, do your own research on that and come to your own determination, but you will come to the same determination as I have. There's no doubt about it. Those are facts. Now, let's talk about Hanukkah and how it has to do with the Maccabees. The Maccabees is a book in this version of the Bible, the New English Bible, that contains several other books that were left out of the 66 Bibles, the 66 book Bibles. This contains something called the Apocrypha. And I've referred to it before in a few of my other videos, but in this particular case, it has a book called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, you may have heard of the name Maccabees. The first book of Maccabees is what we're going to stick to today, but the second book of Maccabees is more information about what happened in the first book of Maccabees. In the first book of Maccabees, we find that Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a leader, a king who has taken over Egypt, has started pushing into Israel. When he pushes into Israel, he's done a lot of things. Okay? He will discuss those here in just a second. But there is a group of people called the Maccabees, who their father, Matthias, and I will read this to you here in just a second, wasn't going to put up with having to have their Torah thrown away, their religious practices, all of them thrown away, their book of the covenant thrown away, and Antiochus Epiphanes actually built his altars of sacrifice on top of the ones that were built to worship God. See, at this time, this was before the birth of Christ, and they were still Jews, and people who were following Torah were still giving sacrifices on the altars. Now, we find ourselves in 175 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes, like I said, is pushing through Israel. And at this time, Antiochus Epiphanes' messengers show up in a town called Modin, which is in Israel, which at the time was a town in Israel. And they show up and they started to set up what is known as the abomination that causes desolation on top of the altar. They built their own altar for Antiochus Epiphanes on top of God's altar. We find ourselves in 1st Maccabees 2:18, when the officers from the king come in to Modin and they order Matthias and his sons to sacrifice on the altar to Antiochus Epiphanes. And he refuses to do so. He says, I'm not going to give up my ways. I'm not going to worship your God as I worship my God, which is another phrase you probably heard in the Bible. Now, not only does he do this and say no, but a Jew from the crowd comes up and starts to do the sacrifice. Well, he isn't going to have that. And in fact, he slew his fellow Jew right there and kept him from doing the sacrifice. And on top of that, he was so mad that they're trying to force him to take away their religious practices of worshiping the one and only God, that he slew the messenger too. After doing so, he knew that Antiochus Epiphanes was going to be coming after him, and he was really, really ticked off. So he and his sons pack up real quick and they head out into the wilderness. Now, this is where the story begins. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of backstory, and hopefully this doesn't take too long. We may have to edit a few things out, but I encourage you to read the story for yourself, because this story would make any Hollywood war movie look like child's play. Okay, so we're going to draw some comparisons here very shortly to things that are going on today. And again, we have had Matthias slay the officers and one of his fellow Jews who was going to do the sacrifice. And what happened is, the word got back to Antiochus Epiphanes. And let's just say he wasn't real happy. So Matthias goes into the wilderness, and the king has gone crazy angry and sent an army to go and squash this, basically, to go after Matthias and his sons. Well, the army goes out into the wilderness, and they encounter a group of Jews who they know on their Sabbath, on Shabbat, that they won't fight. So the army, of course, what do? They do the tactical thing, and they wait for Shabbat to happen, and they attack these Jews. The Jews didn't do anything. They stood there and got slaughtered. That's what happened. And they didn't set up a blockade. They didn't resist. The army comes in, they kill them, and there it is. It was easy. And this news goes back to Matthias and his sons. Well, they are already getting in volunteers from other group of Torah followers. And they're building their army now. Their volunteers are building up in the wilderness, and they hear this news, and they're ticked off. Let's just make this the Cliff Notes version. They're ticked off, and they all together said, we don't care what day of the week it is. It could be the Sabbath. We're going to fight. We're fighting for God. We're not going to get run over by this. Again, they're not putting up with this. They have a force that's building. The next thing that happens is, in this timeline, is that Matthias ends up dying of old age. He gets weary and tired and old. And they have some battles, but Matthias ends up dying, and Judas Maccabees, his son, takes over. And things get very escalated from here, because King Antiochus Epiphanes builds his army. Now here's some things that might correlate with what's going on today, and it might sound familiar, so here we go. I'm going to read this to you from 1 Maccabees 2. No, it's 3. 1 Maccabees 3 and 25. 1 Maccabees 3 and 25. Thus Judas and his brothers began to be feared, and alarm spread to the Gentiles all around. His fame reached the ears of the king, and the story of his battles was told in every nation. Remember, they were tearing down all of the pagan altars. They were tearing down all of the idols, and these were all to worship the king. When King Antiochus heard this news, he flew into a rage and ordered all the forces of his empire, all of them. This includes the guy who's cooking food for everybody. Listen, they're all going. Ordered all of the forces of his empire to be assembled, an immensely powerful army. He opened his treasury and gave a year's pay to each one of his troops, ordering them to be prepared for any duty. But he found that his resources were running low. Does that sound familiar with things that are going today? Hey, we're going to go to battle. We're going to get our forces ready to go, but we ain't got any money. So see how this pans out. His tribute also, in other words, his people who thought of him as a ruler, their tribute to him wasn't very good at that point. And it had dwindled as a result of his and it had dwindled as a result of the disaffection and violence he had brought upon the world by abolishing traditional laws and customs. He now saw with alarm that he might be short of money, and he had happened once or twice before, but only for his normal expenses and for the gifts that he had been accustomed to distribute with an even more lavish hand than any of his predecessors on the throne. In other words, to keep his people happy, he was throwing money at them. Here, have $1,200 as a stimulus. Or does that sound familiar? Or here, have this money, and we're gonna keep, keep my you're gonna keep being happy that I'm your king. We're gonna throw some money at you. So he goes ahead and sends his troops to Persia. And what does he do? He collects He goes to Persia and he collects the tribute from the provinces and raises a large sum of money. And it goes on that he raises this large army, and he's going to bring it up against Judas Maccabees and his army. And these are bloody, brutal battles. And the Maccabees are routing them. Just going to town on these guys. No matter how big their army is, the Maccabees don't have nearly as many people, or probably even as highly trained as Antiochus Epiphanes and a few other leaders that will come up against them. But they keep winning. In fact, one of the strategies that Antiochus Epiphanes has done and is going to continue to do for a short time is he has taken over parts of Israel, he's opened the borders, he's brought in his own people who are foreigners to the land and said, hey, here you go, have a bunch of money, have some land. These people will be subservient to me, and so these are my people. And he starts running out the Jews. It's the replacement theory. That's kind of going on today with the border down south and bringing in a whole millions of new people. Yeah, it's not new. So Antiochus Epiphanes has this replacement theory, if you will, and he starts destroying all the Jews in the land. Well, the Maccabees ain't having it. The temple has already been destroyed by them, by the Antiochus Epiphanes. The temple's been destroyed. They are ticked off. And during this time, they started running low on food, water, and, of course, oil for the menorah. And at one point, they weren't able to get that food. Again, it's debatable whether it was out in the wilderness where they were having a fight or whether it was near the temple. But either way, they couldn't get the resources they needed. And the oil for the menorah was supposed to have just for one day. And in fact, the menorah, the light on the menorah, burned for 8 solid days. You see, this is a miracle that occurred here. And not only did that miracle boost the Maccabees even more, but it helped to push everybody that was not following God's law out of Israel. And it goes on to where one of the important things to take away from this and to know about the Maccabees and Antiochus Epiphanes and Apollonius, whatever his name is, another army and his leader in their army who came against the Maccabees. These people, when they would come into Israel, they would take away a lot of the religious artifacts. They would take away riches. They would take away cattle. They would take away... But when the Maccabees were fighting back, they pushed these people, and of course they had to kill them. They killed them and they pushed them back, but they didn't plunder them for their own stuff. They were just getting their stuff back. That's all they were doing. They weren't raiding them to take their women and their children and their homes or their land. They were literally trying to reclaim what they had lost. That's all they were doing. They were fighting with vigor. They were fighting a righteous battle with the power of God behind them. They weren't going to take someone coming into their homeland and forcing them to give up their service and their worship of the Almighty God. They weren't going to put up with it, and they didn't have to. And God found that was righteous and was there with them the entire time. Of course, people did die in battle on both sides. But in fact, I would rather, if I were in that time, I would rather, if I'm going to die in a battle, I would rather die in the service of my God, the God, than die in the service of some pagan king who thinks that he can set an altar up on top of the God's altars and force sacrifices. I don't have to put up with it. I will not put up with it. And guess what? I'm going to do it because it's righteous. So, we can see that there are things going on now where the powers that be are bringing in new people to replace the people who are here because they're more subservient, if you will, and they're replacing a lot of the people that are here. Not only that, they are having wars and rumors of wars, and they are funding it by taking money from the people and pushing it that way, and printing their own. We don't get political here, but unfortunately, politics have to do with what's going on. It is my belief, my understanding, that we're under judgment here. And they were under judgment there. When you get an evil leader, and you see all the things that are happening, all the changes, all of the pagan holidays that are celebrated, and all of God's feasts that are in the Bible that He has mandated, and it says forever these feasts are supposed to happen. Not enough people are celebrating those, and everybody's flocking to these pagan holidays. Guys, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I hope that there's other people out there who view these videos and understand the reason I'm here, the reason that everybody who does tribulation videos is because God has put these words not only on our heart, but He has put them in our minds and has allowed us to give them to you freely on this channel. Feel free to do your own research. Test everything that we say here. Look it up in the Bible. Find out for yourself. We're here to plant that seed. We hope it grows. We hope that you find Christ and that you find the one and only true God. He is powerful. He is wonderful. He is mighty, and He is to be feared. I believe He is coming back, and it may not be in my lifetime, but it will be soon in His time. And if you're not ready, then you will be the bride who shows up to the wedding and is left outside because you didn't have enough oil. I don't want to be that person. And I don't want to have blood on my hands that I didn't deliver the message that God wanted me to deliver to you. And so, I feel that I've done so to the best of my ability today. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to get social with us, please check us out on our Facebook page. Please leave a comment down here. And we respond to those as soon as we get them. And it's usually very, very quickly. We do our best to put out the highest quality content as possible. Understand that my editing ability is not the greatest. It is what it is. And we do our best to bring you the best content.